can go from one end of the spectrum to the other.
She was a voice that could split the heavens, a thunderstorm and a prayer wrapped in one breath.
No, he's come up with a book of trash. That's all that is a book of trash. Lies, lies, and more lies, and lies on top of lies.
When she sang, churches shook, presidents wept, and nations remembered their wounds. She was gospel fire and velvet tenderness. She was Aretha. But behind the crown of the Queen of Soul was a life bruised by struggle. A girl who lost her mother too soon. A woman who bore children while still a child herself. A superstar who fought for respect, not only in her music, but in her marriage, in her contracts. In a world that wanted her voice but not her freedom. We know the myth. Aretha Franklin, the greatest singer of all time. But the truth is heavier, rawer, and far more human. The truth is a story of survival in an industry built to devour. The truth is a woman carving her throne out of grief, faith, and unyielding defiance. Because Aretha was not just the soundtrack of an era, she was the era. In church pews and picket lines, at funerals and inaugurations, her voice became both weapon and balm. While America wrestled with its conscience, civil rights, women's liberation, war abroad, unrest at home, Aretha gave it a hymn to believe in. But even as the world bowed at her feet, Aretha faced battles no audience could see. The toll of fame, the shadow of abusive love, the weight of expectation. To be flawless, fearless, divine.
Leave these old dudes alone, the younger brothers are turning it out.
And through it all, she carried herself with a quiet storm that only grew more powerful with time. The stakes? They're bigger than music. They're about how a black woman forged the language of survival into art, how she turned private pain into public healing, how she demanded, with every note, that the world honor her humanity as much as her genius. Tonight, we are not just retelling the story of Aretha Franklin. We are peeling back the crown, hearing the heartbeat beneath the anthem, and discovering how a woman born into struggle became a queen who could never be dethroned. Tonight, we're telling the story they tried to silence. Welcome to Echoes of Soul, where voices never fade, even when silenced. We uncover the untold struggles, the secret battles, and the raw truth behind the icons who gave soul its heartbeat. Chapter 1. The Choir and the Chains. Before the glittering gowns and royal titles, there was the church. Not just any church, but the New Bethel Baptist Church of Detroit, where sermons thundered and choirs roared like storms on a summer night. Here, little Aretha Franklin stood, a child with a voice too large for her small frame, a sound that seemed to pierce through stained glass and into the heavens. Her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, was no ordinary preacher. They called him the man with the $1 million voice. His sermons drew crowds the way Aretha's records would one day fill stadiums. Civil rights leaders sat in his pews. Martin Luther King Jr. himself spoke from his pulpit. The Franklin's home was not just a house. It was a crossroads of gospel, politics, and art. Musicians, activists, dreamers, and wanderers all passed through, their voices mingling late into the night. But childhood was not all hymns and harmony. Aretha's mother, Barbara, left when Aretha was just 6, worn down by CL's infidelities. 2 years later, she was gone forever, dead of a heart attack before the age of 35. The little girl who would one day be called the Queen became, at heart, a child without a mother. And loss is a sound that never leaves you. It lingers in every note. By 12, Aretha was already a mother herself. A child bearing children, carrying responsibility before she could even claim her own adolescence. The whispers never stopped. About her father's affairs, about her pregnancies, about what went on behind closed doors. But Aretha did what she always did. She sang. The church was her refuge, but it was also her chain. The same sanctuary that raised her gifted her with song, but also bound her with expectations. To be perfect, to be holy. To carry the Franklin legacy like a mantle she had no choice but to wear. And yet, When she opened her mouth, none of that mattered. The little girl became a vessel. Her voice was both balm and blade. It comforted the grieving, but it also sliced through doubt, fear, and pain. It was not just talent, it was destiny. Still, even destiny comes with its own weight. And the child of the pulpit would soon be thrust into a world where the church's hymns gave way to the neon lights of nightclubs. A world far less forgiving and far more dangerous. The choir had given her a crown. The chains would make her fight to keep it. Chapter 2. Velvet Shadows. The church had crowned her, but the world beyond the stained glass had its own temptations, wrapped in neon velvet and shadows. By her teens, Aretha's voice had outgrown Detroit's pews. Her father knew it. The gospel community knew it. Word spread fast. There was a girl whose voice could lift saints to their feet and make sinners weep. Reverend C.L. Franklin became more than a father. He became a manager, guiding Aretha from revival tents into the secular world, convinced she was destined to be not just a star, but a phenomenon. It was Columbia Records who struck first. In 1960, John Hammond, the man who had signed Billie Holiday and would one day discover Bob Dylan, brought Aretha into the fold. To Columbia, she was the next great American voice, destined to follow in the path of Ella and Sarah. But Columbia didn't understand Aretha. They dressed her in jazz ballads, pop standards, middle-of-the-road arrangements. They clothed her voice in velvet gowns and tuxedoed orchestras, dimming the fire that burned inside her. The music was elegant, sophisticated, but it wasn't Aretha. It was someone else's idea of her. And yet, in those years, something essential was happening. Aretha was learning the industry's cruelty. The meetings in boardrooms where white executives spoke about her voice like it was a commodity. The way decisions were made about what she would sing, how she would be packaged, who she was supposed to be. Offstage, shadows thickened. Aretha, barely 20, carried the weight of motherhood, fame, and fractured love. Her marriage to Ted White, who became her husband and manager, was a storm from the start. White's control was suffocating, his temper violent. "He's not good for her," friends would whisper, watching bruises hidden beneath the glamour. But on stage, even in Columbia's mismatched arrangements, something would break through. A phrase, a cry, a gospel fire flickering through velvet shadows. The people who heard it knew. The real Aretha was straining to be heard. She was a woman caught in two worlds, the sanctified pulpit and the secular stage, the velvet ballads and the raw gospel cry. And in that tension, she was sharpening herself, waiting for the moment when the world would finally let her be Aretha. That moment was coming. It would not come in the polished halls of Columbia, but in the gritty studios of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. There, the queen would be born. The shadows were velvet, but velvet can smother, and Aretha was ready to break free. Chapter 3. A crown forged in fire. The velvet shadows were behind her. Columbia's polished ballads had failed to capture the thunder in her chest. But in 1967, when Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records extended his hand, Aretha Franklin stepped into her true kingdom. She traveled to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, a place that smelled of sweat, cigarettes, and raw sound. This was no glitzy Manhattan studio. It was a converted warehouse, a room where white Southern musicians and a young black woman stood face to face in the heat of segregation-era America. The tension was thick, the stakes heavy. But when Aretha sat at the piano, her piano, not the one they hired for her but the one she demanded, everything changed. She didn't just sing, she played, she directed, she commanded. The band followed her, not the other way around. And out of that night came, "I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You." One song, and suddenly the world knew what Columbia had failed to understand. This was the birth of the Queen of Soul. And then came respect. Otis Redding had written it as a man's plea. Aretha turned it into a woman's demand. With just a shift of phrasing, she turned the anthem on its head, spelling it out letter by letter, sharpening it with gospel fire, infusing it with centuries of women's struggle and black resilience. It wasn't just a hit, it was a revolution. Respect stormed the charts in 1967 during the very height of the civil rights movement. As marchers filled the streets, as women began to raise their fists, Aretha's voice became their soundtrack. She wasn't just singing about love, she was singing about survival. She was singing for every woman told to be silent, for every black soul told to wait their turn. Off stage, though, the fire that made her great often left scars. Her marriage to Ted White grew more volatile. The same man who stood beside her as manager was also her tormentor. Behind closed doors, there were shouts, blows, tears, the kind of pain hidden behind makeup and gowns. Yet every night, she walked on stage, crowned invisible but unshakable, and delivered the gospel of her survival. Aretha Franklin was no longer just a singer. She was a force of nature, a woman whose voice carried both rage and redemption. And the world crowned her, not with jewels, but with the word that would follow her forever, Queen. But royalty comes with a price, and the higher she climbed, the sharper the knives around her became. The crown was forged in fire, but fire consumes as much as it creates. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Throne. By the early 1970s, Aretha Franklin was untouchable, the queen of soul. Her voice poured from every radio, every jukebox, every church basement and nightclub stage. From Chain of Fools to Think, from You Make Me Feel Like, A Natural Woman to Rock Steady, her music wasn't just popular, it was prophetic. She had become the soundtrack of America's transformation. Civil rights leaders marched to her songs. Feminists raised her lyrics like banners. Even presidents leaned on her voice to consecrate their moments. When she sang, the country listened. But the higher the crown, the heavier it pressed on her temples. Behind the applause was exhaustion. Endless tours. Record executives demanding hit after hit. A public that saw her as invincible when, inside, she was breaking. Her marriage to Ted White, always violent, always volatile, finally collapsed, leaving behind bruises not only on her skin, but on her spirit. She had fought for respect on stage, and too often found none at home. And then came the shocking twist. At the very height of her reign, Aretha Franklin, the queen, stopped showing up. Missed concerts, abrupt cancellations. Audiences left waiting in darkened halls. Rumors swirled. Was she ill? Was it exhaustion? Was she cracking under the pressure? Few knew the truth. Anxiety was strangling her. Depression gnawed at her. The woman who seemed to command every stage in the world sometimes couldn't bring herself to step onto one. The stage that crowned her was also the stage that terrified her. The tabloids feasted, whispering about breakdowns and secret battles. But those who loved her knew better. Aretha was carrying more than anyone's soul should. The weight of her childhood scars, the demands of motherhood, the shadow of her father's towering presence, the hunger of an industry that gave her no rest. And yet, every time doubt threatened to silence her, she answered with fire. In 1972, she returned to the church for the recording of Amazing Grace, a gospel album, raw and alive, recorded in a small Los Angeles church with a sweating, shouting congregation. It sold over 2 million copies. The best-selling gospel record of all time. The Queen had stumbled. But she was not defeated. Her crown was not held up by record executives or journalists. It was held up by faith, by fire, by a voice that could not be silenced. Still, the cracks were showing. The throne was heavy, and the battles ahead, with the industry, with the times, with herself, would test Aretha like never before. Every crown is heavy, and sometimes even queens bend beneath the weight. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Spotlight. The 1970s had crowned her, but by the end of the decade, the spotlight was shifting. Disco reigned. The dance floors pulsed with four-on-the-floor beats, mirrored balls scattering light across the walls of America's clubs. Aretha Franklin, whose voice had carried nations through struggle, suddenly seemed like yesterday's sound to an industry obsessed with the new. Radio programmers who once bowed at her feet now hesitated. Record executives whispered that her reign might be ending. And yet, Aretha was still Aretha. Her voice could still scorch the air, still lift hearts to the rafters. But even queens can feel the cold draft when the spotlight begins to move away. Personally, shadows thickened. She battled weight fluctuations, health scares, and the creeping grip of depression. Friends and family whispered about her drinking, about sleepless nights, about the loneliness that fame could never soothe. She had survived an abusive marriage, but love did not come easier in the years that followed. Suitors came and went, many exploiting the queen's vulnerability, many taking more than they gave. The stage, once her sanctuary, often became her battlefield. Anxiety stalked her steps. There were nights when she could not face the audience, when the thought of walking into the glow of the spotlight filled her with dread. Fans were left waiting in half-lit venues, tickets in hand, not knowing the war raging inside her mind. But the shadows did not silence her completely. When she sang, the truth poured out, fierce, vulnerable, undeniable. Songs like Until You Come Back to Me and Something He Can Feel reminded the world that even when the industry's attention wandered, Aretha could still deliver a performance that silenced doubt. And there were moments of resilience that sparkled like diamonds in the dark. At her gospel shows, she remained unshakable, her voice burning with the same fire that first raised her crown. In church, she was not an industry product. She was a vessel again. Yet, culturally, the world was changing. Disco, funk, and later hip-hop reshaped the soundscape. Younger audiences looked elsewhere. Aretha, the voice of civil rights, the queen of soul, was left standing at the edge of the stage, fighting to remind the world she was still here. But Aretha Franklin was not built to fade. And when the 80s arrived, she would rise again, not just as a queen of yesterday, but as a force reborn. The shadows closed in, but some voices are too bright to stay in the dark. Chapter 6, The Phoenix Crown. By the dawn of the 1980s, many in the industry had already written her obituary. The Queen of Soul, they said, belonged to another era, to marches and hymns, to jukeboxes and vinyl. The disco wave had left her stranded. Younger artists crowded the stage, but Aretha Franklin was not built for silence. She was fire, and fire, even when buried under ash, will always find a way to rise. Her rebirth began with a spark: Clive Davis. The legendary record executive saw what others had forgotten, that Aretha was not a relic, but a phoenix waiting to take flight again. Under his guidance at Arista Records, she was paired with modern producers, sharper grooves, and music that pulled her into the heart of the new decade. In 1982, Jump to It, produced by Luther Vandross, gave Aretha her first gold album in years. The sound was fresh, but the spirit was unchanged. She wasn't imitating trends, she was bending them to her will. Suddenly, the Queen was back in rotation, not as nostalgia, but as presence. And then came the anthem of the rebirth, Freeway of Love, a track that roared through radios in 1985, blasting with saxophones and neon energy. It wasn't gospel, it wasn't respect, it was something new. Aretha commanding the wheel of modern R&B, speeding down the highway with her crown shining in the rearview mirror. The world was reminded and reawakened. Awards returned, Grammys piled. Stages once again trembled under her voice. She duetted with George Michael on I Knew You Were Waiting for Me, a #1 hit that proved she could share the spotlight with a new generation and still reign supreme. But this was more than a commercial resurgence. It was a statement, a reminder that legends don't retire. Queens don't step aside politely. They rise again and again, every time the world doubts them. Offstage, Aretha's life was still no fairy tale. The old battles remained, health struggles, complicated family dynamics, the ghosts of her past. But in the music, she was untouchable. The Phoenix crown gleamed brighter than ever. The Queen of Soul had shown the world she could be reborn. But even as the fire carried her forward, another storm was waiting. For no crown, not even hers, comes without its shadows. Every phoenix burns before it soars. And Aretha's final trials would test whether her fire could truly be extinguished. Chapter 7, Thunder and Grace. By the 1990s and 2000s, Aretha Franklin no longer needed to prove herself. She was the Queen of Soul, her crown secured not by charts but by history itself. And yet, even as the decades turned, she never stopped fighting. On stage, in her body, in her spirit, the thunder was still there. In 1998, when Luciano Pavarotti fell ill at the Grammy Awards, Aretha was asked, with almost no rehearsal, to step in for him. She performed Nessun Dorma, an Italian aria, in front of a stunned audience. Not just pop royalty, not just gospel fire. She conquered opera in real time, without a net. The ovation shook the rafters. It was one of the defining moments of her career, proof that her voice could inhabit any realm, any tradition, any language. But behind the thunder, there was struggle. Aretha's health declined quietly, then loudly. Battles with weight, with exhaustion, with illnesses she often kept private. Cancer would come, though she rarely spoke its name aloud. The queen guarded her kingdom fiercely, even from sympathy. Still, grace followed her. At every turn, when the world braced to mourn, she would reappear. Thinner, frailer perhaps, but with a fire that could still split the air. Her 2009 performance at President Barack Obama's inauguration was more than music. Wrapped in a hat that became iconic in itself, Aretha sang "My Country." "'Tis of thee" with a voice cracked by time but sharpened by history. It was not just a performance, it was a benediction. The Queen blessing the first Black president of the United States. A dream her father, her community, her generation had prayed for. Even in her last years, when illness carved away at her body, she delivered shows that defied mortality. At the 2015 Kennedy Center Honors, she sat at the piano, draped in a fur coat, and sang "Natural Woman" for Carole King and President Obama. Mid-song, she rose, tossed the coat to the ground like a gauntlet, and filled the hall with thunder. The president wiped away tears. The audience roared to their feet. Aretha was fragile. Aretha was eternal. But time is undefeated, even against queens. In 2018, Aretha Franklin left this world. The news sent ripples across every continent. Streets filled with her voice, strangers crying to songs they had grown up with. Civil rights leaders, presidents, pop stars, preachers, all bowed in grief. The Queen of Soul was gone, but her grace remained, echoing in every heart she had ever touched. The thunder had ceased, but the grace still lingers, soft and eternal, in every note she left behind. Chapter 8. Legacy. What is a legacy? Is it the sound of a voice echoing across generations? Is it the crown left on a throne no one else can claim? Or is it the way a life, bruised, battered, but unbroken, continues to teach us how to survive? Aretha Franklin's legacy is all of these and more. She was not just the Queen of Soul. She was the architect of survival through sound. She took gospel's cry and stitched it into the fabric of pop, R&B, and rock. She took the fight for civil rights and set it to music, so that marches had a heartbeat, protests had a hymn, and broken spirits had a balm. When she sang, she did not just entertain, she fortified. Her influence stretches far beyond her own time. Hip-hop producers lifted her voice from vinyl grooves, sampling her soul into beats for a new generation. Singers was from Whitney Houston to Beyoncé, Adele to Jennifer Hudson, carry pieces of her phrasing, her thunder, her command. Every melisma, every gospel run, every demand for respect in music today owes a debt to her. But beyond the sound, her life itself is a mirror. Aretha showed us the contradiction of genius, that you can be both unstoppable on stage and fragile in the quiet hours. That the same woman who could silence presidents with a note could be silenced by anxiety, by grief, by illness. That even a queen can bleed. And in that contradiction lies her greatest gift. Aretha Franklin did not ask us to believe in perfection. She asked us to believe in power, the power of resilience, of faith, of voice. She asked us to understand that our struggles do not erase our crowns, they define them. Her story forces us to ask, what do we demand of our voices? When we ask artists to carry our pain, our joy, our revolutions, what do we give them in return? And how many Arethas have we lost to the weight of our demands? Still, one truth remains unshakable. The Queen may be gone, but her kingdom endures. In every church choir, in every protest chant, in every soul singer who closes their eyes and reaches for the heavens, Aretha Franklin still lives. Her crown was not buried with her. It rests on every voice that dares to rise, even in the face of silence. We've walked through the fire and the grace, the shadows and the crown. We've seen the child at the piano, the young mother forced to grow too soon, the woman who demanded respect and turned it into a global hymn. We've seen her rise, falter, rise again. a phoenix crowned in gospel fire and wrapped in velvet thunder. Aretha Franklin was not just a voice. She was a vessel. She carried generations on her breath, the prayers of her mother, the sermons of her father, the chants of civil rights, the aching whispers of women who had been silenced too long. She gave them all song, but her story also reminds us that genius is never free. Behind the applause was anxiety. Behind the gowns were bruises. Behind the crown was a woman carrying more weight than the world will ever truly know. And yet, she never stopped giving. She poured herself out until the very end, leaving us a well of music that will never run dry. This is why we return to her. Not just to marvel at her notes, but to remember her struggle. Because in her voice we hear ourselves, the pain, the fight, the faith, the demand to be seen and respected. That is why her songs still echo, why her crown cannot be touched. Now I ask you, what is your favorite Aretha moment? Was it the raw gospel of amazing grace? The electric demand of respect? The fur-draped thunder of Natural Woman at the Kennedy Center? Or perhaps a quiet song that held your hand when no one else could? Tell us. Because every memory keeps her alive, every story adds another jewel to her crown, and if this story moved you, stay with us. Because the story of soul is never finished. If Aretha's fire broke your heart, wait until you hear how Marvin Gaye's final days carried the same prophecy of pain and brilliance. The queen is gone, but her echo remains. The curtain falls, the voice carries on. Now, if you thought this was a roller coaster of a story, wait until you hear the untold story of Marvin Gaye, tragedy of a soul legend. Click the video in screen now to watch it.